is bad for solving problems in the world. Welcome to the world of the discourse on Chinese privilege in the Singaporean context, a conceptualization that in the last 6 years has triggered numerous discussions. Some have argued against its existence or even the usefulness of the concept as a way of understanding the state of inter-ethnic relations in Singapore. Yet others have argued not just for its presence, but also persistence in creating conditions that create discrimination and impediments for ethnic minorities in Singapore. These polaristic arguments on Chinese privilege have had the effect of, as my colleague argued, not just creating a war of words, but also perhaps a so what state of affairs. So instead of agitating over the mansplaining and Chinese-plaining, as happened in the above story, as well as in several instances of the discussion, debate, and dialogue sessions on the topic, I would like to take to heart the advice of my male Chinese colleague and focus on better to show how privilege is bad for solving problems of the world. Now, Chinese privilege in Singapore. One of the major reasons given by those, including scholars, who deny the existence or utility of Chinese privilege is that it is a literal transposition of the concept of white privilege. Those of you in the States would know this concept pretty well. Such criticism, then, actually, I argue, is a literal transposition of a single argument made by Singaporean activist Sangeeta Dhanapal, who was responsible for popularizing the term Chinese privilege in common usage. In a 2015 interview, Sangeeta revealed how she came to conceptualize the term Chinese privilege. I remember the exact moment. I was reading Bell Hooks' beloved Community, A World Without Racism. I deeply sympathized with what she was saying, even though she was speaking about a different context. I performed a simple experiment. I took a paragraph I particularly loved, and I substituted the words Chinese for white. I read it back to myself, and the moment of realization that that paragraph could have been written about Singapore and not the US was what made me realize that racial privilege is not simply a white phenomenon. I don't mean that I never realized it before, only that I had lacked the language to express it in a way that wholly encompassed the experience, not as a singular, but as universal to minorities here. There is irony in the fact that Chinese privilege as a concept is deemed non-existent or untenable because it is derived from a Western concept, white privilege. The irony being that concepts such as meritocracy and multiracialism, two of Singapore's founding charters, have their origins in the West, and these two charters are often promoted to argue against the existence of Chinese privilege in Singapore. Let me, in this brief talk, then explore these three concepts namely Chinese privilege, multiracialism, and meritocracy, where the latter two are seen to contradict the former. On the contrary, I show that it is precisely multiracialism and meritocracy that uphold the existence of Chinese privilege as a phenomenon that animates reality in Singapore society. Firstly, to understand the phenomenon of Chinese privilege, one has to unpack the two terms that this phenomenon comprises, namely Chinese and privilege. As sociologists Go and Chong have argued, Chinese is a complex ethnicity that seems to be reduced to a one-dimensional racial ethnicity in works arguing for the existence of Chinese privilege. The two sociologists are quite right in their argument against the one-dimensional portrayal of Chinese ethnicity in Singapore. Sociologists Tong Chi Keong and Chan Kwok Ban, in their 2001 work, One Face Mini-Masks, The Singularity and Plurality of Chinese Identity, show that the Chinese in Singapore are divided along generational, linguistic, religious, educational, and socioeconomic lines. They also proclaim that certain cultural virtues, such as filial piety, placing the nation above self, were distinct Chinese traits. Tong and Chan call these diverse perceptions of Chinese identity as mini-masks, referring to the different cultural aspects of Chinese ethnicity. At the same time, the two sociologists argue that there are certain core features of ethnic identity that have, over time, become closely tied to ascriptive features of phenotype, bloodline, and lineage, resulting in a strong sense of sociological boundary of who can and who cannot be Chinese. These racial features they refer to as one face. Hence, summing up Chinese identity in Singapore as one face, racial, with many masks, cultural, Tong and Chan say that Chinese identity is both non-negotiable and negotiable. While accusations have been directed at the concept of Chinese privilege as being a transposition of white privilege as popularized by Peggy McIntosh, while accusations have been directed at the concept of Chinese privilege, sorry, let me see if I'm reading it quite correctly here. Sorry, I got the wrong page here. Okay, it is important to note that race and ethnicity, these two terms are often conflated in the official parlance in Singapore. It's not only an ascriptive phenomenon from the perspective of the raised or ethnicized people, but it is also one ascribed, or rather inscribed by the state as well. As anthropologist Jeffrey Benjamin noted in his definitive work on multiracialism in Singapore, the PAP, or PAP here refers to the ruling party in Singapore, which forms the government. The PAP's ideology of multiracialism regards the relationship between language, race, and ethnic identity and culture as completely solidary. By doing so, the state labels each race in Singapore. Now, in Singapore, there are 4 major races, and they are represented by Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others, as having a race language and a race religion. In the case of the Chinese, they are homogenized as Mandarin speakers. So Mandarin is their race language, whose race religion is Buddhism/Taoism, with the two often conflated in the Southeast Asian Chinese context. Now, what such homogenization does is that it ignores regional linguistic differences within the Chinese community. The Hokkiens from Fujian province, Cantonese and Teochew from Guangzhou province, and Hakka from both provinces are actually sidelined. This homogenization also disregards religious distinction within the community. There are also Christian Chinese and Muslim Chinese. Promoting Mandarin as the race language of the Chinese has led to the suppression and banning of other Southern Chinese languages, which are often relegated to the status of dialects. This has contributed to the destruction of communication between Mandarin-speaking grandchildren and their so-called dialect-speaking grandparents. Now, the state's focus in managing racial relations in Singapore through a policy of multiracialism has been to homogenize intra-racial distinctions while exaggerating interracial heterogenization. So to go back to Tong and Chan's argument on one face, many masks, the Singapore state, represented by the ruling People's Action Party government, promotes a singular version of race, while in reality, there is a plurality of identities exhibited by these singularly classified racial groups. The next part of the phrase Chinese privilege is privilege itself. Now, let me explore the second half of the phenomenon. And this is what has created a lot of indignation, frustration, as well as hope for many in Singapore, that of privilege. Here, I would like to understand privilege, not merely as a phenomenon, but this is an attempt by me to try to theorize privilege. I'm trying to understand privilege using three frames. So this is a very, very new attempt, and I would like to have your feedback on this, I'm going to try to understand privilege as a concept, as an ideology, and as policy. Now, here I use Lien Kuen Phi and Michael Hill and Lien Kuen Phi's work on multiracialism, where they subjected multiracialism to a similar treatment. They tried to look at multiracialism in Singapore as a concept, as an ideology, and as a policy. So this is what I'm attempting to do here as well. So I welcome all comments from you to help me concretize my attempt or otherwise. Let's look at the idea of privilege as concept. Taking after race scholar Peggy McIntosh's work on white privilege, which is the standard reference for privileged scholars, privilege as a concept comprises unearned benefits that are often unacknowledged. People may possess privilege as a result of their race, gender, or by inhabiting bodies considered normal or unimpaired, all of which confer certain advantages. Now, this is from my colleague, Lavanya Kadirvelu. As McIntosh says, everyone has a combination of unearned advantages and unearned disadvantages in life. As such, privilege as a concept is non-exclusive. It is in this understanding of privilege that one meets rejection and opposition from those who possess it without having worked for it. Privileges as unearned advantages by that group with social, political, and often economic power, though these are not evenly distributed, can make disadvantages be the result of extrinsic factors such as hard work and resultant success propelled by an ideology of meritocracy. It can make these advantages appear as if they are fairly earned and hence deserved. Those groups that do not attain success are seen as not having worked hard enough. That they deserve the failure they encounter then becomes the obedient narrative. Let's look at privilege as an ideology. Akin to Antonio Gramsci's analysis of hegemony, privilege as ideology provides a theory on how power functions. Gramsci developed his analysis of hegemony to understand how the power of dominant classes was reproduced. The tool of hegemony which supported the reproduction of dominant class power was ideology, which here refers to a system of beliefs, values, attitudes, and morality that permeated throughout the society to support and entrench power relations. Likewise, privilege as ideology confers power on those, often the dominant class, that possess it. The creation and enduring power of privilege as ideology rests upon the principles of meritocracy and multiracialism, two founding charters that have wholly permeated Singapore society to invisibilize privilege. In a soon-to-be-published paper on the theory of privilege in Asia, Lavanya Kadirvelu